Cool.
All right, let's go.
Thanks for listening. And for those of you who don't know me, my name's Philip Arneil. I'm a photographer. I'm currently in Dublin at the moment after 20 long years in Japan. And I'm here with James Catchpole, who is my partner in the Tokyo Jazz Joints project.
Good evening. Good to talk to you, Philip. It's been a long time.
It has been. It has been. So we're here today to talk about Tokyo Jazz Joints, specifically today because it's March 27th, which means obviously it's the highlight of both our years, as it's the anniversary of when we began this project 5 long years ago in a tiny, grimy little jazz bar called Pithecanthropus Erectus in Kamata, sort of down at heel suburb of Tokyo, and that's where the project
beautiful
began.
Urban downtown Portside Tokyo.
Oh
Yes,
yeah,
the first of many drunken nights in jazz bars when we were telling our significant others that we were working on a project.
well, obviously the drunken obviously applies only to you, but yeah, fair enough.
Well, we can't all be born in Ireland, you know.
Indeed. So yeah, so how does it feel? Like it's been 5 years. We thought it'd be a good chance to just chat a little bit about the project and maybe a few anecdotes that we have behind the project, maybe a couple of standout places or experiences that we've had throughout the course of the 5 years, and then maybe just touch a little bit on what the kind of next steps are for the project, because, you know, we never thought when we began with that one place that it would be going 5 years later. And certainly from my side, I plan to get back to Japan and do a bit more photographing. So there's a lot more to come from Tokyo Jazz Joints.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, after 5 years, it's kind of hard to believe. Neither of us thought we would still be doing and talking about this project when we started, you know. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we've shown the pictures around a lot of different places already. But again, at the start, it was more just an idea. I think I remember, I mean, we knew each other peripherally, but had not really hung out much before starting this project. And so when you pitched it to me, I was so happy just because, you know, I had been doing my own Tokyo jazz site for about 5, 6, 7 years. But just really more as an informational site, just a database. There's nothing artistic about it. There was no real photos. I took photos on my flip phone at the time, so you can imagine you remember what they look like. I mean, they were just, every place looked alike. So, yeah, when you pitched the project to me, it's, you know, kind of pooling our knowledge and skills and going around to do it, I was completely into it right from the start.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I had this kind of epiphany when just before I left Japan, I went with a friend down to Kansai to check out a few places that we hadn't managed to get to before I left Japan. That was nearly 3 years ago, and I think it was on a sort of a really rainy season day that we managed to get to Hello Dolly in Kyoto. And I think it was when I went in there for the second time I realized that I had this kind of moment that the first time that I'd been there, like 5 or 6 years previously, I think was the moment at some point during that experience, this kind of seed had been planted of like, oh, these would be interesting places to photograph. And I think looking back now, that's where the idea originally came. But I remember that day that we went to meet in the now famous JBS in Shibuya.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Which I don't think was as famous then as it is now. Maybe some of our Japan-based listeners will know JBS is a jazz blues soul. It's just a record bar that, for many reasons, really took off overseas and became like a magnet for a lot of tourists, which is quite unusual for these kinds of places, you know.
But I mean, I think, you know, that day I was kind of nervous about the idea, but obviously, for those of you who don't know, as you know, I'm a photographer. James is a broadcaster, a DJ, and he's done a lot of research and a lot of work and writing around like music culture in Japan. And I knew of his kind of listing site, so I thought he'd be the perfect person to kind of do the project with because he had the background knowledge. He knew a lot of the owners. He knew a lot of the locations. And that was like fundamental when we started planning kind of places to go, because obviously James knew what easier places to perhaps start with or places that maybe were in threat of closing and stuff like that. So I remember coming away that day from JBS that kind of feeling quite sort of buoyant and like thinking, okay, well, this might be something. And then obviously we arranged to meet in Pithecanthropus. I think it's like a couple of weeks later.
That's right. It was just a couple weeks later, and I had the exact same thoughts because I knew I had attended your photo exhibit when you did the jazz dancer scene here in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and when you pitched me the idea, I thought, okay, this isn't just like a photographer who doesn't know anything about the music or is just interested in sort of the, you know, sociological side of it. You're actually a really big fan as well. Because, you know, I don't think it would have worked. It'd be hard for us to go around to 150 places if you didn't dig the music and we didn't really bond over that. That would have been really probably a bit uncomfortable and repetitious after a while. But the fact that you had the photo skills, the interest, and a love of the music, you know, I think once we kind of hit our first couple bars, it was like, oh, this is really going to be fun and fulfilling as well. And particularly when we went to that first night in Pithecanthropus, which is one of the older, you know, divier places you could imagine in Tokyo. You know, the photos right away we could sense that like there's something special here that needs to be captured visually because you just can't describe it, you know, too much to people. They don't really get what you mean. They think of, especially outside of Japan, when you talk about, oh, you know, I was drinking in this classical jazz bar. They're going to have an image of something very different, something that's more like in New York, you know, where there's live music. And they don't really understand the atmosphere of what it's like in Japan, where it's a listening bar. You sit down and listen to records, and you really don't talk much. So, you know, being able to capture that visually was just such a great idea. I mean, it's hard to believe nobody had ever come up with this idea before you did, you know.
Yeah, I mean, my memory certainly of that first night, you know, is very much like we did know each other, as you say, but it was very much a kind of like a club friendship where it'd be like, oh, hey, how's it going? You know, we'd meet.
Right,
at
a lot of
events.
mutual friends, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I remember we met at the station. That's when I got my first experience of how quick you walk. So I was kind of dragging behind you as we made our way towards Pithecanthropus. And I was wondering, was it something I'd said? But anyway, we arrived, and of course, typically it was closed. And I always kind of remember that as a real pivotal evening because I think, you know, it could have worked out so differently. So my memory of it is that we went there, it was closed. I think we tried calling. They had like a landline. We got no answer. And I think then you suggested we went to a sort of a standing bar nearby. We had a couple of drinks, a couple of snacks. Went back again. I think it was still closed. Had another drink. And then I think the third time we came back, it was the shutter had like happily come up. And of course we went in. And I always think back to that night because I think, you know, I wonder, had it been closed that night, would we have just sort of thought, well, you know, this is not going to really work and pack the whole thing in. And, you know, that was 162 joints ago. So, you know, it's funny how like these things kind of, they pivot on this sort of, this one moment in time, you know, it's fascinating.
And it was a good harbinger for what to expect because unlike almost everything else in Japan, jazz joints don't operate according to any set schedule. You can never rely on the times that you might see listed on the web if they even have a website or their business card. You know, they generally open when the owner gets there, and that really can fluctuate depending on the day. So sometimes you might be around early and you see the light on, and other times the guy never shows up. I mean, we've run into that experience a lot of times now where, you know, we've seen the listings, but for some reason the place was closed, you know, and it's just a different world to what you expect in the rest of Japan. But
yeah, so I mean, anyway, I mean, from that night, I guess we kind of just, it kind of started to tick over. We made some plans, did a couple a night. And to anyone who doesn't know, like, what we do, you know, it's interesting, you know, you talking about me being a sort of a fan, because I think my whole approach to photographing it is very much a sort of like a kind of embedded one, if you like, in the sense that, like, you know, we go there, we tend to go in, you know, do our greetings or whatever, sit down as customers, we order drinks, have a bit of a chat, get a feel for the place, kind of, you know, figure out whether the owner seems like he wants to have a chat or she wants to have a chat. And then, you know, we kind of generally engage in conversation. And at some point then, in the evening, you know, I'll kind of ask in fairly polite Japanese if it's okay to take some photos. And that's how we kind of capture the places. So it's not a sort of a parachuting in, parachuting out kind of experience. We kind of really enjoy the joints as customers. And amazingly, like in all the places that we've been to, we've never been refused permission to photograph. You know, there's one or two owners who preferred not to be photographed, and sometimes Japan being kind of a private place, you know, they'll say, please photograph, don't put any customers' faces in the photographs, you know, if there are any customers there.
Well, no, there was the one place. There was one place in
Yeah,
Saitama that they didn't let us take pictures,
true.
and I remember it was strange because they were obviously always polite, as most people are in Japan, but we couldn't figure out the reason, and so I decided to push it and ask him. I don't know if you remember this place up
Yeah.
near Kawaguchi in Saitama, and he said, well, you know, a couple of reasons. One is that, you know, we get a lot of like annoying sales calls here, and you know, it just makes us a little cautious. And the second reason was because they had a lot of female customers. So this kind of jazz place, I guess, in a way to maybe make more money, they cleaned it up and they started offering nicer tea and cake sets to appeal to Japanese women, and to increase their customers, not just have the old guys who come at night. But you know, for obvious reasons, they don't want two strange Western men coming in taking pictures of the place when it's full of female customers, because again, that would be a bit of an invasion of privacy. So I still remember that was the only place that we could never take even a picture of like the records. Just I remember asking, can we just take a picture of the albums? And he was like, look, I'm really sorry, we can't do it.
I think also he mentioned something, I think I remember vaguely a sort of something along the lines of not wanting to be featured in like social media or something. So I think they were obviously trying to keep the place quite, you know, sort of off the grid, if you like. But I mean, it wasn't the end of the world. I think, you know, we like in terms of how we choose the places that we photograph, you know, we kind of go based on sometimes on reputation, obviously sometimes geographical location. And there are places we've been to as well that we haven't photographed, or, you know, just decided that maybe they didn't quite fit like aesthetically or in terms of like the kind of general vibe with the project. So the project like is very much, you know, the purpose for us is to kind of capture for me certainly as a photographer is to document and record this kind of amazing jazz bar culture in Japan, because like it's disappearing, it's vanishing. You know, within the context of the project, even there's 15 or 20 places that we photographed and visited have already gone.
And that's not even updated. I mean, you know, it's funny because we were prepping to talk about this, and I started thinking more and more about Miles, which is a tiny little bar, hard to describe to people who've not visited Japan. I mean, imagine you went to visit your 85-year-old aunt who lived in a studio apartment, cluttered with jazz records and old magazines and dusty lamps. This is what the bar is like. And Miles had been, you know, there was rumors about, of course, there's no website for this place, but we'd heard through the grapevine the old lady was sick and the bar was closed. She wasn't going to reopen. And then miraculously, she recovered and opened the bar again. So the fact that we were able to get there at that time when her health was clearly already very failing, was so special because, you know, I don't think that even the owners themselves often appreciate how special their shops are. That's one thing that I always try to get through when I take people around, or, you know, when we, you know, my website, the photo project we're doing, is that, you know, people who are jazz fans from other countries can get it when they visit. Wow, this is a really cool spot, you know, but the owners sometimes don't get it. And they've often expressed that to us, you know, why do you guys want to take pictures? Like, what are you doing? Why me? Why my little dusty spot, you know?
Yeah, I think with Miles, like I have a vague recollection of us going once and the shutter being down. And I think we looked in the window of the house. There was sort of like a chink in the curtains in the window below where clearly the owner was living. So we saw the owner kind of like in her own kind of living room, like, you know, tatami style space. But at that point, she was obviously still quite ill. So she wasn't opening upstairs. And it's funny, like when we finally went back and got in, and I look back now as a photographer on the pictures, you know, and some of the earlier places that we shot, you know, they look to me much more kind of cautious and like a bit reticent. You know, I think even at that stage, you know, as we were getting like 5, 10, 15 places under our belt, I was still just like easing into it. And, you know, anyone who's experienced Japan in any way, you know, you realize like you don't want to cause offense to people and you want to kind of tread carefully often. And I think like, for me, I'd love to go back to some of those earlier places and re-photograph them like we did with Pithecanthropus, because like, you know, as the project went on and confidence in the project grew, and we started to show some of the photos online and in different exhibitions and in magazines and things, you know, I think my confidence as a photographer definitely grew in terms of, you know, I was much less, you know, I think it's at the start I was kind of trying to sort of maybe hide in the shadows a bit and really not cause any kind of like disturbance whatsoever in taking the photos. And I feel like maybe with those earlier places that kind of restricted a little bit the visual images that I got. But so it's really interesting.
It's interesting that you felt that way, because I guess it's because I didn't feel that way when I saw the pictures, you know, but maybe it's because those initial places that we went were ones that I was more familiar with.
Yeah.
And some of them I had been many, many times. So for me, it was almost more like, oh yeah, you know, this is like finally a little bit taste of what I've got from this joint over the years. You know, it's finally got the right picture of it that I can show to people, you know. So I didn't feel that way at all, but you know, that's a different kind of perspective. And I mean, certainly we got over that feeling pretty quickly. I think within, you know, generally within 2-3 minutes of, you know, ordering a drink and sitting down, I'd start to chat with the owner. Wouldn't immediately talk about the pictures, but would start explaining a little bit about what we do, and then you know, inevitably they would give us some permission. So
yeah, I think you know, for me, that the reaction of a lot of the owners is something that really drove the project on, because I think they were so, you know, at first often a bit baffled by the whole thing, but they kind of just were so flattered in some ways, or so surprised that we were even doing something like this. The one that really stands out in my memory is a place called Mura in Kyoto, and I remember going in, and if you look at the pictures on the website, you'll notice it instantly, because the owner's wearing a really bright red sort of Hawaiian style shirt, and the bar is sort of particularly stands out because he has this huge fish tank with
yes, yeah.
huge red fish in it. And I remember going in there particularly and feeling a real kind of like a bit of a sort of a vibe, you know. It was very local neighborhood place. This guy had the kind of look of him like he could maybe play, you know, like a sort of like a mobster in a Japanese film. So he just had this kind of energy about him. And it was only when I eventually approached him and started talking to him, and I remember just chatting, and he was quite kind of frosty. And then when I said, like, you know, that we visited and photographed about 120 places, like his face just like, it was like a switch, you know, it just completely changed, and he loosened up and like really warmed up. And in the end I got, you know, a great portrait of him as well as photos in the bar. So, you know, that enthusiasm is something that's really driven on the project, because I think, you know, that the owners, like you say, that they don't really know what they're sitting on. They don't really know how amazing these places are. And a lot of them often say to you, don't they, like, you know, when you tell them you're American, they often say, oh, but you have these places in America, right?
Exactly. Especially when I say, you know, I'm from New York, they're like, oh, it's the capital of jazz. I say, well, for the live scene, sure, you know, but there's very, very few places, if any, that you can go sit down and listen to records. And they're not going to be a full collection like you find here. Go back to what you just said, though, about the owner's reactions, is that, you know, once we had started doing this for about a year or so, the word started to spread around about us, which was incredible. And what we also realized was that a lot of these owners knew each other. Now, that seems a little bit strange, because you think if you've been running a jazz bar or cafe for 30 years, how would you know all these other people? Because you never go out. You're pretty much running the place all the time. But we found that once you drop the names of a couple of key famous jazz spots in Japan, oh yeah, I've been there and I know the owner and we took pictures, then that opens up a lot of doors, especially when we started going outside of Tokyo. And we would mention some of the famous Tokyo jazz spots. Immediately, the coolness or the sort of cautiousness of dealing with two foreign guys would melt away. That happened when we went to the north of Japan. Do you remember? We spent the day up in Iwate Prefecture, which is a couple hours on the bullet train from Tokyo. And I think, how many places did we hit that day? 5 or 6?
Yeah, about that, yeah.
Especially the two things that stuck out for me was, you know, you leave Tokyo, so you think, okay, there's not going to be as many great authentic jazz joints, but they're everywhere. I mean, probably the most memorable one from that day was going to a place called Ray Brown, named after the great bass player. And the Ray Brown Cafe is basically just the first floor of this guy's house in a very drab northern Japanese country town where there's literally nothing around. Except you go into the cafe and then you see a gigantic portrait of Ray Brown, the bass player, and his wife with this Japanese guy and his wife at his wedding ceremony. And it's just such I mean, it literally made me do a double, triple take. I was like, wait a second, this guy had Ray Brown at his wedding and he lives up in the middle of nowhere in Japan. What is the story here? So sitting with him for an hour and hearing how he became really good friends and he used to promote gigs and all of this, it's just like, oh my God. I mean, you know, you would never expect it to find this up in the countryside, and yet we found it again and again and again in so many different spots.
And I can't remember, you probably do, but do you remember then after that he approached us about trying to get in touch with, was it Quincy Jones?
It was, yes, it was so Quincy Jones. That's right.
Basically, after we finished, he kind of said, "Oh, by the way, would you know any way to get in touch with Quincy Jones? Because you know, obviously, all Americans know each other." So, and it turns out he had some footage that he'd taken in in '69 or '70 of video, like 8mm footage of Quincy Jones in concert, and he had discovered this in his house and wanted to get this footage to Quincy Jones.
Incredible. Yeah, I'll just pull out Quest Company's number out my cell phone and I'll give him a ring. Yeah. Oh my, that was nuts. I mean, that day, so Ray Brown, and that was the same day we went to Basie, which is, for people outside Japan who might be listening to this, Basie is probably one of the 2 or 3 most famous jazz cafes in the whole country. Due to a couple of reasons. One, the audio system, and 2, the owner, who, how would you describe Swifty to
well,
people
I'd say the way that I would describe him is the way that we found him when we went in. So when we finally got there, I mean, for us, this was like a kind of like, this was our kind of pilgrimage to Mecca moment, wasn't it? Like, this was the jazz.
Oh yeah.
So we got up there, we kind of came in very, very reverentially and sort of like we were entering like a temple or a church or something. Sort of sat down, you know, kept our voices nice and low, and then we spotted him off in the corner, and you know, you can see the portrait that we eventually got of him on the website, but he was sitting off to the corner at a huge round wooden table. He was in a sort of a cream kind of sports jacket.
Yeah.
Sunglasses on, hair slicked back, fingers covered with rings, and he was writing poetry in Japanese with a black fountain pen and sort of sipping a drink. And then all around him was this kind of like memorabilia and signed photographs and notes and kind of all this amazing jazz sort of memorabilia. And we just kind of were in total awe. And
he was sitting underneath a picture of McCoy Tyner, of him and McCoy Tyner. And I was just thinking like, oh my God.
Yeah.
What was McCoy Tyner doing up here in the 70s, you know?
Yeah.
And we should tell everyone as well, this was before 12 noon. This was because the place opens at like 11:30, I think. So we got there right in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right in the morning. And it's 11:30 and he's already got the wine out and chain smoking. Never took his sunglasses off. And then do you remember his friend that came, who was even more of a dandy boy?
Yeah.
Who used to be the editor. So his friend, so Swifty, Sugawara-san, who runs Basie, the amazing jazz cafe up north, he's probably in his early 70s. And then, so when we finally sit down to chat with him, we explain what the project is. He immediately pulls the chairs out. He calls the waitress over. We start getting free drinks, free highballs and beer. And it's barely noon. And then his friend comes in, who's even more of a dandy, wearing a navy blue blazer, small round sunglasses. He's about the same age, in his 70s, and he used to be the editor of Playboy magazine in Japan. Yeah. Two of those guys go way back. So they just sit there and start reminiscing and drinking wine and talking to us about the old days and the jazz scene there. And it was just like, it was like walking into a movie. It was almost as if they planned it for us, you know?
And it all happened so quickly too, because I mean, for those of you who don't know James and I, like, you know, I'll generally be sitting, and then once I start photographing, he'll also decide to get up. So a lot of my time photographing is sort of is kind of telling James to get out of the frame of the picture. But like, I remember going to the toilet and coming out, and by that time you'd gone on a wander. And I'm always so terrified because, when we ask permission to take photographs, it's like one of these real moments because you're just dreading, that someone will say no. Because obviously if you kind of surreptitiously take photographs, you can take photographs anywhere, but you don't necessarily get the best photos. But equally, if someone says to you, don't take photos, then, it's disrespectful and I think sort of a bit unethical to then go ahead and take photographs. So I went off to the toilet. By the time I re-emerged from the toilet, James had somehow made contact with Swifty. He'd invited him over to the table. And so I remember coming out of the toilet and James saying to me, oh, come on, we've been invited over. And then suddenly this sort of phalanx of women who were working there just came, like, sort of descended on our table, took all our bags, our coats, all our stuff, moved it over to his table. And we were kind of plunked down there. And then, of course, he clicked his fingers, and next thing, like, drinks and snacks and all this stuff started to emerge. And we kind of just had sat, I think, for about an hour and a half, and like had an amazing chat with him and managed to get
a great chat. We got the pictures. We even walked out with a few gifts that he gave us, a couple of magazines and other souvenirs. And it was just, and it's so crazy because that was pretty much the start of the day. And, I think by the time we ended that night in Sendai, I was feeling pretty rough by the time we got out of the last joint.
Where was the last joint? Where did we end up? Do you remember? Was it Count?
Oh my God, no, it wasn't Count. Count, we met that really nice couple who actually had heard of us as well, remember?
I tell you where it was. It was Kelly. It was that little weird snacky place. It was like a snack. It had been a...
No. It was an even smaller one after that where they were playing a live gig where Honda Tamaya-san was playing with his Led Zeppelin jazz group. It was that place.
Is it Cabo?
Yes, Cabo. That was
something like that.
That seats about 5 people plus the band.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and we sat outside waiting until they finished playing the gig to go in.
Yep. So here, listen. Let me ask you the question that I hate the most. People often ask me, and I got this a few times when we exhibited the project in Munich back in January. What's your favorite place?
I mean, yeah, that's just come on. It's how could you even?
Yeah, it's tough, right?
It really is. It's such a cliche. It's like they're your children,
you're welcome.
But 160 places. I mean, I don't know because there's places that I've been that are kind of my old regular joints that I've been going to for 10 plus years, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily make them my favorite. But I would say that as a couple highlights, as we mentioned, the first joint. Pithecanthropus erectus, named after the Charles Mingus album, where we started the project. That just because of its location in a very unfashionable part of Tokyo, its absolute refusal to adopt to the modern world. It makes no concessions to the modern customer. It is dusty, dirty, poorly lit, poorly ventilated, completely smoky, with food that you would never touch in a million years.
A total fire trap.
It's a complete fire trap. Yes, it's everything that you think would turn people off, but when you enter into it, it's magical because it's like going back to 1965 to listen to the new Mingus records that came out. So definitely there. A place called Eigakan, which is a sort of a little hard to describe, but in Tokyo, where the owner used to be a film director, so it's like all these great film posters plus jazz. And definitely Ray Brown, which we mentioned just because of the amazing story. But yeah, there's so many places, and we didn't even get to, we did a rather overly ambitious trip to Hokkaido and Kyushu in 5 days, flying from the north of the country to the south of the country. And we popped into a few places there, like that would make my top 5 list, like Naima in Oita Prefecture. Do you remember that one where we met the owner's daughter, who was based in New Jersey?
Yeah,
she spoke English. I
was going to say that one actually because we were we were out in the car this time and we were driving around. I think it was kind of southern part of sort of eastern coast of Kyushu around Oita, and we stumbled on this place, Naima, and like we knew nothing about it. And you can see the photographs on the website as well, but it was basically a house sort of sunken about, I'd say, 3-4 feet into the ground. So you had to go down sort of a staircase to get to it.
I
It
thought
had like
it was more like a concrete bunker, actually.
but it was like it
That's
had
what.
like a pyramid roof as well, right? So the roof
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
pyramid, and inside the roof, when you went inside, it was all like wooden, like sort of beams and rafters and things like that. And up there was like a huge double bass and recording equipment. And then downstairs there were like sofas. And I always remember that huge Sonny Rollins poster of him
Yes,
as a samurai.
yes, yes. One of his Japan tours. Plus, there was like a big bookshelf, a lot of CDs and albums, and it was just amazing because it's just so random that the owner's daughter was there visiting back from the States, and she spoke such good English and
Yeah,
was completely amazed that we found her parents' shop. She's like, "How did
yeah.
you guys get here?" Like, because I mean, imagine they're not going to get any foreign customers in there at all.
Well, it's funny because I think, like, for those of you who haven't been to any jazz places like this in Japan, I mean, if you imagine the most suburban, blandest kind of suburban neighborhood that you can think of in the area that you live in, and then just drop this incredible jazz cafe into the middle of that. And that's kind of what you're talking about. You turn a corner, this kind of very gray, faceless kind of Japanese suburban streets, and you turn this corner and there's like a small parking lot and this enormous black and white lit sign of Coltrane's face. And it's that kind of like it's that kind of experience. So we were so amazed to find some of these places, and you just kind of wonder how these places survive and how they kind of are still going after like 30, 40, 50 years in some cases.
I remember that sign too, because you don't get that in Tokyo because there's no space,
Yeah, yeah.
And that leads us to the greatest sign of all the places, because it's the entire side of a 2 or 3-story house in Kyushu, a
Yeah.
little bit outside of Fukuoka City. I forget the town name now, but it's maybe, what was it, about 20 minutes drive outside Fukuoka?
Yeah.
And that was Coltrane. And Coltrane is a cafe on the first floor of this 3-story house surrounded by nothing else. It's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's actually next to a soccer stadium. And it's painted a sort of a mix of lime and forest green. And on the side of the house is a giant mural of John Coltrane. And you just think, like, is there any other country in the world where you would find this?
Yeah.
I mean, it's unthinkable that you would see this anywhere else but Japan. Now, getting into that place was a bit of a hassle. I don't know if you want to tell the story of that. We had to come back, what was it, twice, I think, before we could get in. And it was the last place we visited in our trip in Kyushu. But we did make it in. And then I remember because they were waiting for us at about 11 p.m. at night, right?
Yep. I think that's a story that we save for the next time, because I think probably we were a bit ambitious in trying to do all this in the time that we set ourselves, which was like 35 to 40 minutes. So I think maybe we kind of pause there. What do you think? And maybe pick up some of these stories. And if people want to hear them, maybe they can let us know through the website, through social media, and we can do another session like this and have a bit of a chat about some of the stories behind the places. If you don't know the project, you can find it online at www.tokyojazzjoints.com, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, also Tokyo Jazz Joints. And it'd be great if you could go along there and have a look at some of the photographs in more detail. There's about 130 odd joints currently on the website, and we'd love to hear some feedback on the project and stuff if you're interested. If you do want to hear more from James and I talking about these places that we've been to, give us a shout, hit us up, give us a message, or get in touch with us on social media, and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, we'll put all our details up on here for people who are listening to this show. Where you can contact us, find us all on social media, and maybe if the reaction's good, we'll come back with a part 2, and maybe do some deep cuts so I can tell you all about Philip's driving habits, which would certainly entertain you. I
can talk about how many times I had to wake you up at the end of the night. How about that?
Hey, I'm very consistent, There's no surprises with me at the end of a jazz bar night.
True. Anyway, listen, it's been great to chat. We'll definitely do it again.
You bet. Let's make a plan for part 2. And please do get in touch with us. Find us both online, and keep swinging.
All right. Cheers, man.
Okay, take it easy. Ciao.
Talk to
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.